10 prehistoric horrors too brutal for any museum to display. Number 10. The Nazca Trophy Heads. On the southern coast of Peru, in the drainage of the Nazca and Ica rivers, archaeologists have recovered more than 100 human heads, deliberately separated from their bodies, treated, and modified for carrying. In 1925, the anthropologist Alfred Kroeber, working for Chicago's Field Museum on the Marshall Field expeditions, shipped a large collection of these heads back to the United States, alongside the pottery and textiles that first defined Nazca culture for the outside world. At a single site, Cerro Carapo, excavators later uncovered a cache of 48 of these heads buried together, not scattered by looters, not lost in a battle, but gathered as a set. Every one of them was prepared the same way. A hole was drilled through the center of the forehead, just above the brow, and a length of cord threaded through it, so the head could be carried or suspended like an object, rather than mourned like a person. The lips were pinned shut with cactus spines. The brain had usually been removed through the base of the skull. This was not the leftover damage of a battlefield. It was manufacturing. For most of the 20th century, the working assumption was that these were war trophies, heads taken from rival peoples the Nazca had defeated, a practice attested in cruder form across dozens of ancient societies. Then, in a 2012 isotope study published in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology, the bioarchaeologists Karina Kellner and Margaret Scheninger analyzed strontium, oxygen, and carbon signatures preserved in the tooth enamel of the Field Museum's trophy heads. The chemistry told a different story. The victims had not grown up somewhere else.
They had eaten the same food, drunk the same water, and lived in the same valleys as the people who kept their heads. Nazca pottery adds a layer the bones alone can't provide. Painted vessels from the same period repeatedly show figures holding trophy heads next to sprouting plants, and some show the heads themselves sprouting like seeds. Researchers who study Nazca iconography, including Donald Prue, have long argued this pairing wasn't decorative. On the southern coast of Peru, where rainfall is scarce and irrigation could fail without warning, a severed head bound to the image of germinating crops looks less like a war record and more like an appeal for fertility, addressed to the land itself. What makes that finding difficult to sit with isn't the mutilation, it's the intimacy. These were not captured strangers processed as symbols of conquest. They were neighbors, in some cases probably relatives, selected from within Nazca society itself and turned into ritual objects, passed hand to hand through generations of the very community they had come from. Most of the trophy heads pulled from the ground over the last century now sit in research storage rather than display cases at the Field Museum and at several other institutions that received material from early 20th century expeditions. Part of the reason is practical. A shelf of prepared human heads, drilled and corded, is difficult to present to a general audience without sanitizing it into meaninglessness or turning it into spectacle. Part of the reason is that Kroeber's generation of collectors operated under rules about consent and ownership that no serious museum would defend today, leaving current curators to decide, case by case, what, if anything, from that era belongs on view.
A head taken from within one's own community is difficult enough to look at directly. What comes next didn't stop at killing its own people. It ate them. Number 9. Cueva de El Sidrón, and the family that ate its own dead. In 1994, cavers exploring a limestone system in Asturias in northern Spain broke into a chamber and found human bones scattered across the floor. Formal excavation followed and continued for more than a decade under Antonio Rosas, a paleoanthropologist at the National Museum of Natural Sciences in Madrid, working with Marco de la Rasilla of the University of Oviedo. What they eventually recovered was not a burial. It was a group of Neanderthals, at least 12 or 13 of them, spanning several generations, from an infant to elderly adults, who died together and were left, or discarded, in the same cave roughly 49,000 years ago. Rosas and his team published their findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in December of 2006. The bones carried cut marks in the same locations, made with the same stone tool technique that Neanderthals elsewhere used to butcher deer and wild goat. Long bones had been deliberately snapped open, the fracture pattern consistent with marrow extraction rather than any accident or animal scavenging. Someone had processed these bodies the way you process meat. In 2011, a follow-up study led by Carles Lalueza Fox of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, also published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, sequenced mitochondrial DNA from the group and found something specific. The 3 adult men shared the same maternal lineage, while the adult women did not share one with each other or with the men. That pattern, related males remaining in place, women arriving from elsewhere, is known to anthropologists as patrolocality, and finding it in a species that vanished tens of thousands of years ago was itself remarkable. It also means the men who most likely did the butchering, or were butchered themselves, were kin to one another by blood. Not a rival band passing through, not captives taken in a raid. A family, eating a family, in a cave, in a world already narrowing around them. This pocket of Neanderthals in Iberia was within a few thousand years of extinction. What drove the group at El Sidrón to this? Whether starvation, ritual, or conflict within the group itself, the bones do not say. And researchers have been careful not to claim more certainty than the evidence supports. What isn't disputed is the butchery pattern, repeated across every individual in the assemblage. Almost none of the roughly 2,000 bone fragments recovered from El Sidrón are on public display anywhere. The overwhelming majority remain in the research collection at the Museo Nacional de Ciencias Naturales, where they continue to be sampled for DNA, isotopes, and dental calculus. This group is among the best preserved sources of Neanderthal genetic material ever recovered. And every fragment consumed by display lighting or handling is one that can't be resampled later as sequencing technology improves. A museum in Oviedo shows visitors a life-sized reconstruction instead. The real skeletons stay in drawers, still being asked new questions. El Sidrón raises the possibility that killing within a family, in extremity, might not have been sacred at all, only desperate. What happened next removes that doubt. It had a name, a schedule, and a god attached to it. Or so the argument goes. Number 8. The Carthage Tophet. In the Salambo district of modern Tunis, beneath what was once the heart of ancient Carthage, lies a walled sanctuary that Greek and Roman writers called a Tophet, a term borrowed, loaded with implication, from the Hebrew Bible's description of a place where children were burned as offerings. Between 1976 and 1979, the archaeologist Lawrence Steger, then of Harvard University, led a project that excavated 445 cremation urns from the site, each holding burned bone, ash, and often a small carved stone marker called a stele. Some of those stelae carry an inscription, the word mulk, that many epigraphers read as a specific term for a sacrificial offering made to fulfill a vow. What was actually inside the urns is where the field split into open disagreement. In 2010, the physical anthropologist Jeffrey Schwartz of the University of Pittsburgh, applying his own aging methods to the skeletal material, argued in the journal PLOS ONE that most of the burned remains belonged to fetuses and infants who died of natural causes, stillbirths and perinatal deaths given a respectful burial, not living children killed in a religious rite. His conclusions briefly reframed the Tophet in international headlines as a children's cemetery rather than a killing ground. Others disagreed sharply. In a 2011 reanalysis published in the journal Antiquity, the biological anthropologist Patricia Smith of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, working with Steger himself, challenged Schwartz's age estimates on methodological grounds and concluded the pattern was still consistent with sacrifice at meaningful scale. The historian Josephine Quinn of Oxford has since argued, drawing on comparative evidence from across the Phoenician world, that dismissing the practice as Roman propaganda invented to demonize a defeated rival does not survive contact with the archaeology. One detail complicates every position rather than resolving any of them. Many urns hold the remains of infants mixed with the bones of young lambs or kids, buried at the same depth under the same class of monument. If this were simply a cemetery for children who died naturally, there is no obvious reason to bury them systematically alongside sacrificed animals. If this were pure religious sacrifice, the animal remains look very much like a substitute offering, an animal's life given in place of a promised child's, an exchange documented in sacrificial traditions from the Mediterranean to the Near East.
The mainstream position today holds that the Tophet represents genuine, if not necessarily constant, child sacrifice tied to specific religious vows. A significant minority continues to argue the skeletal sample is contaminated by ordinary infant mortality. But here is what remains undisputed on every side of the argument. Infants were cremated at this site in enormous numbers across roughly 6 centuries of continuous use, inside a sacred precinct built for exactly this purpose. Much of the excavated material remains in Tunisian and American research collections rather than on public display, and the reason is not hard to see. There is no way to exhibit thousands of infant cremation urns to a general audience without taking a side in a live scientific argument, and no comfortable case for putting a nursery's worth of burned children on view before researchers themselves agree on how they died. Carthage argues about method. Sacred Ridge offers none.
What happened there is written directly onto the bones, in a language that leaves no room for alternate reading. Number 7. Sacred Ridge, and the massacre that tried to erase a people from memory. A federal dam project built the case against reading Sacred Ridge as an isolated accident of history. Before construction could begin on Ridge's Basin Dam and its reservoir near Durango, Colorado, federal law required a full archaeological survey of the land the reservoir would submerge. Between 2002 and 2005, archaeologists from SWCA Environmental Consultants, working under James Potter and Jason Chuipka, excavated a cluster of ancestral Puebloan pit structures dating to the early 800s. What they found stopped being a routine cultural resources survey almost immediately. Inside 2 of the pit structures alone, excavators recovered 14,882 identified fragments of human bone, representing at least 30 to 35 individuals, roughly half the estimated population of the entire settlement. Someone had torn the roofs off these structures and thrown the processed remains inside afterward, in some cases onto hearths that appear to have still been burning. Potter and Chuipka published their full analysis in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology in September of 2010, under a title that stated its conclusion outright: A Case for Ethnic Violence. The bones showed perimortem trauma far beyond what killing requires. Feet had been broken in patterns consistent with deliberate hobbling before death. There was damage consistent with scalping. Eye sockets showed injuries suggesting the eyes had been removed while the victims were still alive. This was not combat. It was punishment, inflicted on bodies still capable of feeling it. The killing alone would be horrifying enough. But here is where Sacred Ridge becomes something closer to an attempt at erasure. The processing didn't stop once the victims were dead. Bones were broken open in patterns matching how the same community butchered deer and other game, then burned, and in some cases defleshed by techniques with no purpose beyond removing every trace of a person's identity from what remained of their body. Whoever did this wasn't only killing a rival group. They were trying to ensure nothing recognizably human was left to bury, mourn, or remember. Most researchers read the pattern as intergroup violence. One community, perhaps recent arrivals competing for the same land and water, annihilating another. A minority of archaeologists have proposed alternative readings, including ritualized violence directed at individuals accused of witchcraft or social transgression within a single community, a practice with later ethnographic parallels in the Southwest. The scale of the destruction and its concentration on specific structures make organized intergroup violence the better supported reading, though the debate has never fully closed. Almost nothing from Sacred Ridge exists in any collection today. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, The remains were determined most likely affiliated with the pueblos of Acoma, Laguna, and Zia, with Acoma taking the lead in the process. Between 2004 and 2010, across 3 separate ceremonies, everything that had been excavated, documented, and analyzed was returned to the ground by the descendant communities themselves. The dam was built, the reservoir filled.
And the people erased once, 1100 years earlier, were given back a version of the burial they had been denied the first time. Sacred Ridge shows what a village could do to a rival community. Anyang shows what an empire could do to its own captives, on a scale that makes a village massacre look almost intimate. Number 6. The Sacrificial Pits of Anyang. Across roughly 200 years, at a single site in what is now Henan Province, China, more than 13,000 people are estimated to have been ritually killed as part of state religious practice. That is not a rounded folk estimate. It is a figure reconstructed from physical excavation and from the Shang dynasty's own written records, inscriptions carved directly onto turtle shells and ox scapulae, used to ask ancestral spirits and gods whether a proposed sacrifice would be acceptable and how many people or animals it should involve.
Formal excavation of the royal cemetery at Xibeigang, part of the Yinshu archaeological zone near Anyang, began in the 1930s under Liang Su-yung of the Institute of History and Philology at Academia Sinica. The largest tomb his team uncovered, designated M1001, was built in a cross shape with 4 descending ramps. On the ramps alone, excavators found 73 human skulls laid out in careful rows, separated from 59 headless skeletons nearby. More than 60 additional victims lay in the tomb chamber and side pits. Around the tomb itself, 22 satellite pits held 68 more people, buried in groups of 1 to 7. What distinguishes Anyang from a battlefield massacre is the order. The skulls in M1001 were not scattered where they fell.
They were arranged, row after row, cleanly separated from the bodies they belonged to. A level of post-mortem organization implying a formal procedure, carried out by people who had done this before and expected to do it again. Skeletal analysis of the headless victims found them almost entirely male, between about 15 and 20 years old. Oracle bone inscriptions name a specific source for many of these victims. The Chang, a rival pastoralist people the Shang state raided, captured, and recorded by name as an acceptable category of offering. More than half of all human sacrifice victims named in the surviving inscriptions are identified as Chang, and individual inscriptions record single ceremonies calling for 50, 100, or, in the largest recorded cases, as many as 300 Chang captives at once. More than 2,500 sacrificial pits have been identified surrounding the royal tombs at Xibeigang.
To put that in perspective, this is not one atrocity, or 10, or 100. It is a bureaucratic infrastructure for killing, maintained across roughly 8 generations of kings, each apparently expected to open or renew his reign with an accounting of the dead owed to his ancestors. Only a small fraction of what has been excavated at Yingshu has ever left the ground for a display case. Most sacrificial remains stay where the dig leaves them, catalogued in site records rather than exhibited, a fact with more to do with arithmetic than concealment. No museum has built a hall large enough to meaningfully present 2,500 pits, and full excavation of a necropolis this size remains, decades later, still incomplete. More than 4,500 individual oracle bone characters have been identified from Anyang. More than 3,000 of them still cannot be reliably translated. In 2025, Chinese heritage authorities and Anyang Normal University, working with Tencent's research division, launched a competition built specifically around using artificial intelligence to accelerate decipherment of the remaining characters, adding to a standing cash reward, offered since 2016, worth roughly $13,900 per character, that only 3 scholars have ever successfully claimed. Somewhere in the untranslated 2/3 of the Shang dynasty's own ledger, there may be sacrifices still waiting to be counted. Anyang killed captives taken from outside its own society at industrial scale and wrote the accounting down. Huaca de la Luna did something closer to the opposite, killing its own young men again and again every time the sky itself seemed to turn against it. Number 5. The sacrifice platform at Huaca de la Luna. The Peruvian coast is one of the driest inhabited places on Earth, kept that way by a cold ocean current that suppresses rainfall for years at a stretch, until a warm water reversal known as El Niño drops catastrophic rain onto a landscape with no infrastructure built to survive it. Modern coastal El Niño events still cause serious damage along this coast. Cyclone Yaku, which struck in 2023 alongside a coastal El Niño pattern, caused an estimated $690 million in damage, left more than 80,000 homes affected, and pushed the country's government to declare a state of emergency across more than half its districts. About 1,500 years ago, the Moche civilization that built its ceremonial capital near modern Trujillo appears to have met the same recurring threat with a very different response. They killed young men on a platform and waited for the rain to stop.
Beginning in 1995, the archaeologist Steve Bourget, then of the University of Texas at Austin, excavated a walled plaza at the base of Huaca de la Luna, known as Plaza 3A. Layer after layer of hardened mud and wind-blown sand had sealed in the partial and skeletal remains of more than 70 young men, mostly adolescents and young adults, deposited across several distinct episodes rather than a single event. The victims had not died quickly or privately. Many showed cut marks across the throat, consistent with a blade drawn hard across the neck. Some still had rope fragments knotted around their necks. Fractures on several skeletons were consistent with a fall or a violent push from the platform above onto the plaza floor where the bodies were left exposed, gradually buried by the mud of the very rains their deaths were apparently meant to stop. Each layer of sediment in Plaza 3A corresponds to a distinct flood event, which means this wasn't a single reaction to a single crisis. It was doctrine, repeated across generations, every time the ocean warmed and the rain came, because it had apparently worked, or been believed to work, the last time. Isotope analysis of the victims suggests some grew up locally and others came from farther afield, consistent with the Moche practice recorded on their own pottery. Ritual combat between rival Moche communities fought specifically to produce prisoners for sacrifice rather than to seize territory. Moche fine-line vessels illustrate the ceremony that likely followed capture in vivid, repeated detail. A richly dressed figure, sometimes interpreted as a priest or a ruler impersonating a deity, receiving a goblet of blood drawn directly from a captive's slit throat. Archaeologists refer to this recurring scene as the sacrifice ceremony, and finding its real-world counterpart, cut throats, restraint marks, bodies deposited in a plaza built for exactly this purpose, turned a motif art historians had puzzled over for decades into a documented event. The Site Museum at Huaca de la Luna displays the civilization's extraordinary painted friezes and its ceramic record of the sacrifice ritual in remarkable detail. What it does not prominently display are the victims themselves. Most of what Bourget and later teams recovered remains in research collections, still being cross-referenced, flood layer by flood layer, against Peru's long and violent climate history. The Moche killed to negotiate with weather. Farther north, in the heart of what became the Aztec capital, an empire built something that negotiated with nothing at all. A monument made from the dead themselves, meant to be looked at. Number 4. The Tzompantli, the Great Skull Rack of Tenochtitlan. The conquistador Andrés de Tapia claimed to have counted the skulls himself, a rack of the dead, standing near the central pyramid of the Aztec capital, holding, by his own wildly specific estimate, tens of thousands of skulls arrayed in the open for the whole city to see. For nearly 500 years, that account was the only real description anyone had of the Tzompantli. Then, in August of 2015, archaeologists broke into a structure beneath a colonial-era building on the street known as República de Guatemala
in the historic center of Mexico City, and found 35 human skulls mortared together with lime into a curved wall. For the first time, researchers from the Urban Archaeology Program of Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, led by Raúl Barrera Rodríguez, could test the conquistadors' account against physical evidence. They kept digging. By 2017, the count had climbed past 480 skulls. Excavation and laboratory analysis have continued for nearly a decade since, and the most recent published tally stands at more than 650 skulls. Recovered not as a flat rack, but as a cylindrical tower, skulls cemented in concentric rings around a still unidentified core. The Conquest-era accounts, and most assumptions built on them, describe the Tzompantli as a display of defeated warriors and captured enemy soldiers, a monument to military conquest alone. The skeletal analysis complicates that picture considerably. Approximately 1/4 of the skulls recovered from the tower belong to women and children, including at least 3 identifiably juvenile craniums. Some skulls still carry the drilled perforations at the temple that Conquest-era sources describe being used to mount heads horizontally on wooden poles as part of the original rack, before they were later removed, reorganized, and cemented into this more permanent tower form. Modern archaeologists treat Tapia's tens of thousands estimate with real skepticism. A conquering army justifying the destruction of a civilization had every reason to exaggerate the barbarism of what it destroyed. But even the excavated, physically verified total, climbing with every new season, describes a monument built and maintained, skull by skull, for at least several decades before the Spanish ever arrived. Barrera has been careful in describing the find not to reduce it to simple horror. In his account, the act of placing a skull in the tower was itself a transformation. The dead were, in his words, made sacred, turned into gifts for the gods, treated less as trophies than as personifications of the deities they were offered to. That framing doesn't soften what the skeletons show, it complicates it. A monument can be an act of terror and an act of devotion, built from the same women, children, and captured men, depending entirely on which side of the wall you were standing on. The Tzompantli is not a completed exhibit. It is an active excavation running beneath a functioning block of one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, threaded around utility lines and modern building foundations. Every skull removed goes first to INA's physical anthropology laboratories for age, sex, isotope, and sometimes genetic analysis, before any decision is made about conservation or display.
Only a portion of what has been found is currently shown at the Museo del Templo Mayor. The rest is still being counted. Tenochtitlan built its monument to killing in stone and bone, in the open, for anyone in the city to see. On the other side of the continent, a very different civilization was burying its own version of the same idea, quietly, underground, inside a mound of earth. Number 3. Cahokia Mound 72. Across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, the Mississippian city archaeologists call Cahokia was around 1,000 years ago among the largest urban settlements anywhere in the world north of Mexico, home to an estimated 10,000 or more people, organized around more than 100 earthen mounds.
Between 1967 and 1971, a University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee team, led by Melvin Fowler, excavated roughly 2/3 of one particular mound, designated Mound 72, and found something that matched no simple idea of a burial monument. Fowler's team eventually documented remains representing 270 people, including 5 distinct mass graves, each holding between 20 and more than 50 individuals. At the center of it all was one striking feature: a body laid out on what excavators described as a bed of roughly 20,000 shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon in flight, with a second body close beside it. For decades, that central figure was read as a single, powerful male ruler, sometimes linked to a hero figure named Redhorn in later native oral tradition. A monument to one man's authority. In 2016, a reanalysis led by Thomas Emerson of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, published in the journal American Antiquity, overturned that reading. The central burial feature held not 6 high-status individuals, but at least 12. And the 2 bodies at its heart were not 2 men. They were a man and a woman, buried together at the center of the monument. What disappears in the new analysis isn't the burial's importance. It's the assumption that power at Cahokia belonged to men alone. A short distance from that central pair, excavators found a pit containing 53 young women, roughly 15 to 25 years old, laid out in 2 rows, 2 layers deep. They showed no obvious signs of violence or malnutrition. By every physical measure available, they had been healthy. That absence of trauma is, in its own way, the most unsettling detail in the entire mound. Whatever happened to them left no mark a skeleton can carry, which fits methods like suffocation or poison far better than open violence. Elsewhere in the mound, a separate mass grave held men, women, and children whose skeletal positions, some twisted, overlapping awkwardly, soil packed into open throats, led Fowler's original team to suggest that at least some individuals may still have been alive when the earth went in over them. Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the University of Illinois currently runs an active Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act project, consulting with tribes, including the Osage Nation, to determine cultural affiliation and eventual reburial for ancestral remains recovered from the site across more than a century of excavation. Nationally, the federal government has distributed close to $2 million in grants since 2021, specifically to fund the return of remains and funerary objects under this law. The 270 people from Mound 72 are part of that unfinished accounting, which means the true, final custody of this burial is still being decided by the descendants of the people who built it, not by any museum. Cahokia hid its dead inside a mound built to look like reverence. Farther south, a different civilization threw its offerings into open water in front of everyone and let the world believe the wrong story about why for the better part of a century. Number 2. The sacred cenote of Chichen Itza. At Chichen Itza, in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, a natural limestone sinkhole nearly 60 meters across held the Maya world's most direct connection to the underworld. Deep, dark, fresh water, sacred enough that offerings were thrown into it for centuries. Between 1904 and 1911, Edward Thompson, an American who had purchased the land the ruins stood on, dredged the cenote with mechanical bucket excavators and later his own diving equipment, eventually recovering an estimated 30,000 artifacts, which he shipped to Harvard's Peabody Museum, much of it smuggled out in diplomatic pouches. The theft wasn't exposed until 1926, when a journalist named Alma Reed broke the story, triggering a repatriation dispute between Mexico and Harvard that has never fully closed. Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History formally requested the return of 20 specific pieces as recently as 2023. Among what Thompson recovered was human bone, eventually identified across decades of reanalysis by the physical anthropologist Ernest Houghton in 1940 and, much later, the bioarchaeologist Lane Beck, as belonging to at least 200 individuals overall, a population that included men, women, and a striking number of children as young as 6. The popular image built around this discovery, cemented by decades of documentaries and postcards, was young virgins thrown alive into the well to please a rain god. It made the cenote famous. It was also never well supported by the skeletons themselves, which include as many identified adult men as women. The stranger evidence sits a short walk away, underground. In 1967, archaeologists found a chultun, a bottle-shaped cistern originally built to store rainwater, that had been repurposed sometime between roughly 800 and 1,000 years ago as a mass burial chamber for more than 100 children. In 2024, a team led by the archaeogeneticist Rodrigo Barquera of Germany's Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published full genome sequencing from 64 of those children in the journal Nature. Every single one was male. Many were closely related. 2 separate pairs were identical twins, a statistical rarity striking enough that finding 2 such pairs among so few burials would be extraordinarily unlikely by chance alone. The Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiché Maya, centers on a pair of hero twins who descend into the underworld and are ritually sacrificed before their eventual triumph over the lords of death. Finding 2 actual pairs of twin boys, closely related to one another, deliberately selected and buried together in a chamber built for this purpose, doesn't prove the myth caused the killing.
But the match between a Maya creation story and a physical mass grave, built centuries before that story was ever set down in the form we have it, is not the kind of coincidence a serious researcher can simply wave away. Much of the human material recovered from the sacred cenote itself never returned to Mexico at all. It remains at the Peabody Museum, catalogued alongside the gold, jade, and rubber that made Thompson's smuggling worthwhile, tied up in a legal and diplomatic dispute over cultural property that is, as of this recording, still unresolved after nearly a century. Chichen Itza's dead are still being argued over on paper, in museum correspondence and repatriation filings. The final entry on this list is being argued over somewhere far harder to resolve, in front of the actual bodies on public display right now. Number 1. The Children of Llullaillaco.
Picture yourself near the summit of a volcano on the border of Argentina and Chile, nearly 6,700 meters above sea level, higher than all but a handful of mountains anywhere on Earth. The air holds barely half the oxygen it does at sea level. There is no plant life, no shelter, nothing alive there by choice. Seated in a small stone chamber, wrapped in finely woven textile, is a 13-year-old girl, arranged as if asleep, who has been sitting in exactly that position for roughly 500 years. In March of 1999, an expedition led by the anthropologist Johann Reinhard and the Argentine archaeologist Constanza Cerruti reached the summit area of the Llullaillaco volcano and found 3 children entombed there. A girl of about 13, now known as the Llullaillaco Maiden, and 2 younger children, a boy and a girl, each around 4 to 5 years old. The extreme cold and dryness of the altitude had preserved them so completely that early photographs of the maiden were mistaken by some viewers for a resting, living person rather than a body 5 centuries old. These 3 were not an isolated case. The Inca state carried out a ritual called Capacocha across an empire that stretched more than 4,000 kilometers, from what is now Ecuador to central Chile, and comparable child burials have been found from Ambato in Peru, where Reinhard, in September of 1995, had already discovered the mummy known as Juanita, to mountain summits across Bolivia and northern Argentina. Selected children, described in Spanish colonial accounts as chosen partly for their physical perfection, were brought from across the empire to Cusco, incorporated into state ceremony, and then walked, in some cases for months, to the summits of sacred mountains, where they were given maize beer and coca leaf and left to die of exposure.
In 2013, a study led by Andrew Wilson of the University of Bradford, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, analyzed the maiden's hair in sections corresponding to roughly the final year of her life. Hair grows at a measurable, near-constant rate, which means each segment functions as a dated chemical diary. Wilson's team found her diet shifted markedly in her final months, moving toward the maize and animal protein reserved for Inca elites, while her intake of coca and alcohol increased sharply in the weeks immediately before death. Radiological scans found coca leaves still lodged in her cheek. By every measure available to modern chemistry, she had been sedated in the final days of her life, not necessarily to reduce pain, but to keep her calm and cooperative on the walk to where she would be left. Consider what the machinery behind this required. It required identifying and selecting a specific child years in advance.
It required moving her, and children like her, across a mountain empire on foot. It required drugging her carefully enough to keep her calm without killing her early, dressing her in textiles that took specialists months to weave, and leaving her at an altitude and temperature calculated to preserve her indefinitely, as a kind of permanent offering. This was not panic. It was not improvisation. It was logistics. An empire treating the death of a chosen child as an administrative project, planned with the same care as a road or a granary. The maiden and the two younger children have been on public display since 2007 at the Museum of High-Altitude Archaeology in Salta, Argentina, a museum built specifically to house them. And the decision to exhibit them remains actively, publicly contested today. Indigenous rights organizations in the region, including representatives of the Indigenous Association of the Argentine Republic, have formally demanded the museum return the children's remains for burial according to their own traditions, arguing that displaying them behind glass in a museum that charges admission treats sacred ancestors as a paid attraction. The museum typically shows only one of the three children at a time, rotating which child the public can see, a compromise that satisfies essentially no one completely, and changes nothing about the fact that this argument is happening now, about a decision made 5 centuries ago, with no resolution in sight. You exist, and everyone you have ever loved exists, because a chain of ordinary survival ran unbroken for hundreds of thousands of years.
Somewhere in every ancestral line feeding into that chain, choices were made about which lives mattered enough to protect and which could be spent as tribute, as insurance against drought, as a gift to a mountain that was never going to answer back. The Inca state that sacrificed this particular 13-year-old collapsed within decades of her death, destroyed by an empire from across an ocean that considered its own violence a form of religion too. What Llullaillaco leaves behind isn't a verdict on the Inca alone. It's a mirror. Every culture on this list believed its killing meant something, and most of them were likely wrong about what exactly that meaning was. The argument over whether we have any right to put the evidence on display, or any obligation to look away, is not a settled question left over from the deep past. It is a live dispute in a museum that is open right now, this year, with a line at the door. Across all 10 of these sites, the actual mechanism of killing changes constantly. A blade at the throat, a rope, cold and coca and altitude, drowning, exposure, blunt force, starvation turned inward on a family. What repeats, without exception, is the presence of organization behind it. None of this was chaos. Every single site on this list required planning, personnel, a shared belief system, and enough social authority to make killing a member of one's own community or a captured stranger into an accepted act rather than a crime. That is what separates all 10 of these cases from an ordinary act of violence. Someone had to build the infrastructure first. The Tophet's walls, the Tzompantli's mortar, the pits at Anyang, the platform at the Luna, the chamber beneath the mountain. And in every case, some specific, nameable human decision is the only thing standing between that evidence and a display case. Sometimes it is the law. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which has moved close to $2 million in federal grants since 2021 alone toward returning remains like those from Sacred Ridge and Cahokia to descendant Pueblo and Osage communities. Sometimes it is unresolved diplomacy. Mexico's still active request for the return of 20 pieces taken from the sacred cenote more than a century ago. Sometimes it is simply unfinished work, the more than 600 skulls of the Tzompantli still being counted a decade into excavation, or the 2/3 of Shang oracle bone characters that remain untranslated even with artificial intelligence now aimed directly at them. And sometimes, as at Llullaillaco, it is a live and unresolved argument between the institution that owns the bones and the community that considers them family. None of these barriers are the same. None of them are censorship, and none of them are conspiracy. They are 10 different, specific, ongoing human judgment calls about where the line sits between education and desecration. And every one of those judgment calls could change with the next excavation season, the next court filing, or the next generation of curators. What stays constant is the fact none of those judgment calls can soften. For thousands of years, on every continent examined here, organized human societies treated the deliberate killing of chosen people as a tool of governance, agriculture, and cosmology, as ordinary in its way as a road or a harvest calendar. The line each museum draws today is not a scientific line. It is the most human line there is, the one between what happened and how much of it we can stand to look at directly. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.